So I hope you enjoyed 1987's The Lost Boys. Pretty well-known movie, part of a group of 1980s movies starring 1980s actors. I think The Lost Boys is both a good vampire film and a good kind of ensemble cast 1980s movie. So I think it's important. It fits in our class particularly well because it's a vampire movie, obviously, but it has some other elements that I think are worth discussing. So The Lost Boys is very much a 1980s film. It stars some of the biggest actors of the 1980s, and we'll talk about those in a second. It has a very 1980s soundtrack, so the music is very heavily associated with the 1980s. This film is part of a group of films in the 1980s where children were kind of left on their own, left to their own devices, if you will, and ultimately get into trouble and sometimes get killed. So if you've ever seen the kind of teen slasher movies of the 1980s, I'm thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th. Again, these were not children not particularly supervised well, Halloween, and ultimately they get into a fair amount of trouble or get killed. So that's important to think about. And of course, The Lost Boys is a reference to Peter Pan, the kind of island of lost children, and the Lost Boys are essentially these children that have disappeared and gone on to become vampires. The Lost Boys is also a film that's about family, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So there are good families, there are bad families. They are mostly incomplete families, which I think is part of the critique in The Lost Boys and in many 1980s films. That, you know, if the family is not a mother and a father and two and a half children, that's a problem. And you see quite a few of those in this film, and in Near Dark, where, you know, they are not what we would think of as a nuclear family, and what problems arise from being part of a non-normative family. So I like to think that today's lecture is brought to you by the 1980s soundtrack. So St. Elmo's Fire, Say Anything, Footloose, Top Gun. You can think of many films from the 1980s where their soundtrack is very, very well known. The Lost Boys would fit into that group. There are some more current films that I think it's important to see how the soundtrack plays into the film. If you're familiar with Donnie Darko, it's a very 1980s soundtrack, though the film isn't a 1980s film, though it takes place in the 80s. And then if you've seen the more recent American Hustle, has a very powerful soundtrack with a lot of music that's contemporary to the film, most of it non-diegetic, so not really part of the narrative of the film, but yet the music tells a story. And in The Lost Boys, the music definitely tells a story, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So, like our other vampire films, the vampire has to appear or enter in some way. In this particular case, our vampires enter on a carousel, but there you see, this is our vampire entrance. This is our first view of the vampire. A little different. Obviously, this is a 1980s vampire. But again, the vampire kind of appears on screen, and that's a moment in the film. We have, as we've talked about before, an establishing shot telling us where we are. We are in Santa Carla, and one would assume Santa Carla, California. Santa Carla is not a place. That is made up. But Santa Clara is real. So there's clearly an allusion there to Santa Clara, just switching a letter or two around. But ultimately, you are supposed to think you're in California, and you're supposed to kind of think you're in a real place, even if it's in fact not a real place. So there are some pretty famous actors in The Lost Boys that are worth talking about. We have the two Coreys, Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, very famous in the 1980s. You might be familiar with some of their work. We'll talk about them in a second. Veteran character actors, Diane Wiest and Edward Herrmann. So ultimately, a character actor is an actor that is kind of never the first build character in the movie. So they're never really the star, but they're often always very similar. So they're not necessarily persona actors in the way that, say, a Robert De Niro or a Jack Nicholson is, but they play often the same characters, and they're always kind of secondary characters within the film. And there are lots of examples of that in other films, but Diane Wiest and Edward Herrmann certainly qualify in that vein. Kiefer Sutherland, star. We will talk about Kiefer's career here in a second, but he was a big star in the 1980s and has kind of seen a resurgence lately. So Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, the two Coreys, here you see them together in the comic book store. They were a team in the 1980s in several films, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not. License to Drive is probably their most famous film next to The Lost Boys. They did some other kind of awful films that most people are not familiar with. And then, if you remember, if you're a fan of reality TV as I am, they did a brief reality show called The Two Coreys. It was not very good. It did not last very long. As I said, Diane Wiest, veteran character actor. You can see her up there. You may recognize her as the mother figure in many, many, many films. She always plays, not always, but almost always plays some sort of maternal figure. So she was, of course, in Edward Scissorhands, The Birdcage, Parenthood. She was in Footloose. She was in awful movies called, one of which being Cops and Robertsons. And Little Men Tate, not an awful movie. And I think probably one of her best roles is in Bullets Over Broadway, where she doesn't actually play the kind of mother character that she plays in most every other film. So I thought she was really powerful in Bullets Over Broadway. You might also recognize her from Law and Order. She played a character on several seasons of Law and Order, kind of the main district attorney on that series. I also mentioned Edward Herrmann, another veteran character actor. You might recognize him from The Gilmore Girls or The Aviator. But if you listen closely to his voice, he has been for a long time the voice of Dodge. So if you see Dodge commercials, you will often hear Edward Herrmann's voice in them. Of course, here's Kiefer Sutherland. Kiefer Sutherland is probably most famously known as the son of Donald Sutherland. Donald Sutherland may not be on your radar, but Donald Sutherland was way famous before there was a Kiefer Sutherland, obviously, because it's his father. But Kiefer is best known these days for 24, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and he was in an awful show that I'm not sure how many people watched called Touch. Fox loved Kiefer Sutherland, but in the 1980s, he had a pretty vibrant film career. He's more associated with television now, but he was in the Young Guns movies, one of the few people to survive to the second Young Guns movie. He was in a movie called Flatliners, in a kind of not so great movie called The Three Musketeers. He was in A Few Good Men, and he was in Dark City. Among those movies, I would say Dark City is probably the best, but I'm a fan of the Young Guns movies. They were westerns, and Flatliners is an interesting movie as well. But just he had a film career, and now is kind of more a TV guy. A couple others that are in this movie, of course, the star Jason Patric. You will remember he went on to a great career in Speed 2. For those of you that saw that one, Jason Patric has not had much of a career post The Lost Boys. Jamie Gertz, a star. You may not recognize her. She's been in a few things here and there, but she's best known to me as the woman who couldn't spare a square in the Seinfeld episode, sitting in the stall next to Elaine, and she was Jerry's girlfriend, one of many girlfriends that appear in the series. So I thought you would enjoy the I can't spare a square screenshot. And then, of course, there's this guy who's just on for a second. Turns out, I would say that's not David Cross, but it's pretty close. Given that this is 1987, David Cross would have been considerably younger in 1987. If you shot this today, that could very well be David Cross, but not in 1987. But I always see this guy and I always like to think that that's David Cross, but in fact, I'm fairly certain it is not David Cross. So The Lost Boys, as I said, had a pretty powerful soundtrack. Artists such as In Excess, Lou Gramm, Echo and the Bunnyman. These were figures of the 1980s, kind of. I mean, In Excess obviously isn't around anymore because the lead singer is dead. But these were kind of some of the bands of the 1980s. Of course, Tim Capello appears on the Lost Boys soundtrack, and for those of you that are not familiar with Tim Capello's career, we can look him up on Spotify and see some of his many songs. So here you can see Tim Capello's vast musical career. He didn't have much of a career in the 1980s, but he was best known as a backup saxophonist to Tina Turner. So that's where you'll find Tim Capello on a Tina Turner song. So, continuing our lesson in diegetic music, The Lost Boys features a concert that the characters in the movie are actually listening to and dancing to and taking part in. So, it's clearly diegetic music, it's part of the narrative. And as concerts go, this is very 1980s. So, here you have your shirtless, oiled up band, the lead singer playing a saxophone. Sometimes in the 1980s they played guitars, but this is a very 1980s kind of concert performance. So I thought you would enjoy all of these screenshots of Tim Capello at his finest. The song People Are Strange that we hear in the movie, uh, again, is a kind of narrative point that the people in Santa Carla are weird, strange. Vampires are strange. But it is a cover of a Doors song. And if you pay close attention when the vampires are flying into the cave, you can see on the wall right towards the back there that there is a Doors poster connecting the song to the narrative. So that's a Jim Morrison poster in the back of the cave. So again, it's not just a song in a movie, it's part of the narrative, even though that particular song is non-diegetic because it's not heard by the characters in the movie. We have the typical 1980s non-diegetic race of some kind. So the race set to music is very much a 1980s thing. So here, Lou Gramm's In the Shadows is part of the motorcycle race that we see relatively early in the film. And if you're familiar with Footloose, the 1984 version, there is a kind of tractor chicken race set to a Bonnie Tyler song, I Need a Hero. So again, this is very much something that happened in 1980s films. So we see some aspects of the vampire film that we would recognize in The Lost Boys. We see that we wear garlic as protection while sleeping in the bed with our mother. He seems a little old for that, but you know, whatever. It's the 1980s and it's a movie. We see the use of holy water when they're filling up at the church with their guns, and that's supposed to be kind of a joke, but also, again, part of the vampire lore of being affected by holy water. We start to see, you know, vampires being associated with insects and bugs, and that actually dates back to some of our earlier vampire films. Vampires, you know, eating spiders and things like that. So that's a clear vampire film connection. Um, you see an actual example of the vampire invited in. So one of the myths of the vampire is the vampire can't come into your house unless he or she is invited in. Of course, that doesn't really happen in movies very often, but here they're calling attention to the fact that he has to be invited in. There's the lack of a reflection, and you can see he's fading away. So he's not completely a vampire yet because he casts some reflection, but he's ultimately fading away, and that's an important point to note. We see in this case the dog, the kind of growling dog. Now, this is a vampire dog that doesn't like people, and we've seen lots of examples of dogs, people dogs, that don't like vampires, and this is kind of the inversion, kind of an allusion to the animals not liking vampires, a vampire animal attacking people. And then, of course, the stake through the heart is a common trope of vampire films, and this film is no exception to that. So we see several examples of vampires being put down by having something driven through their heart. And then, of course, the vampire being affected by sunlight, we've seen many times and will see many times. So again, a reoccurring theme of vampire films. There's lots of examples of family in The Lost Boys. So here you can kind of see the vampire family hanging out in the tree. But there, you know, anytime you see the group together, it's kind of like a family. They seem to walk around like a family. They're together all the time. The missing child on the milk carton. So of course that's a direct reference to the little boy vampire Laddie, that he is a missing child. Um, this you don't see as much of anymore, but in the 1980s they started putting missing children on milk cartons. You may not remember that. You may not even have had milk in a carton in your life. They come in different containers now. But ultimately, putting children on a milk carton was a way that they thought would help find missing children. I'm not sure how effective that campaign was, but it was very much a 1980s, 90s thing. And then, of course, the head vampire, the kind of dad vampire, if you will. And he directly says, you know, I want to make you a part of my family. I want to combine your family with mine. It's almost like a demonic Brady Bunch, if you will, the joining of two different families, in this case, to make them all vampires. So, The Lost Boys is very much an on location film, and Prince discusses locations and sets in chapter 3, so I would read that chapter pretty closely. But what Prince says is that building huge sets for movies is something that dates back even to the silent period. So if you see the picture on the left there, is they were building the set for Metropolis, the silent movie that I mentioned earlier. The slide in the middle is a shot from Cleopatra, the Elizabeth Taylor movie, where they built enormous sets. It was incredibly expensive. And then of course the shot on the right is a shot from Lord of the Rings, another movie where they built considerable sets. Now, uh, there's a certain element of the films that can be dealt with through CGI and 3D technology that allows for a greater set experience without actually going through the cost and expense of building a giant set and having thousands of extras. But The Lost Boys has a look and feel that's associated with the place in which it was filmed. And in this case, it's kind of this California town. But there's no evidence that the film was, you know, primarily shot on a soundstage or that you're not actually in the place where the film is taking place. Every now and then, directors like to play tricks and cinematographers with locations. So if sometimes you think something's a real location and it's not. So Prince uses the example of the kind of molten metal factory in Terminator 2, if you've seen that film, shot in the location of an actual factory, but the factory itself was shut down, so they had to use some tricks to make it appear that the factory was in fact functional. Sometimes when you're in a real place and a film is presumably shot on location, it's not. So we don't do a lot of filming in Vietnam, despite having much better relations with Vietnam now than we did 20 or 30 years ago. But a lot of directors use Vietnam, use the Philippines, shots in the Philippines instead of going to Vietnam. And you can see that in, you know, lots of different examples. A lot of any war movie dealing with the Vietnam War was probably shot in the Philippines and not in actual Vietnam. Prince talks about how matte painting and translates can be used to extend the size of backgrounds. So I would read up on both of those terms. And just to give you a couple of examples of how much the location of the film can have an impact on it. If you look at the David Fincher films, Seven or Fight Club, if you've ever seen those, they have a feel of a city. I mean, people often incorrectly think that Seven takes place somewhere in New York, yet it doesn't, because there's this kind of desert scene towards the end, which doesn't make any sense. So both of those films have a feel of a location, but they never actually say where they are. And I think that that's important to keep in mind when thinking about locations. So the Nixon article that we read compares a film called The Hunger, and you can see the poster for The Hunger there, a film we saw Near Dark, and The Lost Boys. And basically what Nixon says is The Hunger is an early AIDS allegory, and we'll talk more about AIDS allegories as we move a little further on. She does make an interesting point that vampires can't get AIDS, and that's because they're already dead. So they can kind of transmit it, but they can't actually get it. I've never really thought about that, but that comes up in the article. As you, I'm sure, could tell, the Near Dark and The Lost Boys are visually different films. Near Dark is much grittier, much darker. I mean, at times it's even hard to see what's going on in Near Dark. And The Lost Boys is very much more a Hollywood production. But some of the clear takeaways of Near Dark and The Lost Boys are these films are very wrapped up in heterosexual relationships. So these vampires don't really have that kind of ambiguous bisexuality that some of our other films have had and will have. It's pro-family, as I've said, showing you what happens if you don't have a normal family. The vampires will come and get you. We see young boys coming of age in both films. We see that vampires are part of dysfunctional families in both of these films. And both of these films allow vampires to be cured at the end. They can become normal people once again, and that is not the case in many vampire films. And both Near Dark and The Lost Boys suggest that becoming a vampire is kind of a lifestyle choice. And that's why it can be undone. So you can want to be a vampire, and then you will become a vampire. So, what are some of the key takeaways for The Lost Boys? Well, The Lost Boys is very much a 1980s film. Uh, it's important to keep in mind that the decision to whether to shoot on a soundstage or to shoot on location is a conscious decision. It can be expensive to shoot on location. It can be expensive to build gigantic sets that involve a great deal of labor and time. And sometimes, if you make a giant set, you need lots of extras to fill the scene. So directors have to think long and hard about what they're going to choose for their location and how much they want to invest in building sets. The soundtrack of The Lost Boys is closely connected to its plot, so the songs signal particular plot elements, and that's important to keep in mind. And The Lost Boys offers a critique of the non-nuclear family, so families that don't have a mother, a father, and 2.5 children often lead to things like vampires. At least that's the message of The Lost Boys and many other 1980s films.